Thanks very much. I'm going to continue to build on this idea of this question of do protected areas work or not. And you'd think the answer should be quite simple. Yes, protected areas work. So the focus of this task force that I'm working with is really to say what makes them work. What are the key drivers of success? And before I start, I want to recognize that a lot of this work has been done by grad students, PhD students, and postdocs. And I want to recognize Megan Barnes and Jonas Geldman and Ian Craigie in particular. Before I start, I want to talk about Biosphere 2. Who in the room knows about Biosphere 2? Has ever heard of Biosphere 2? It was an experiment in the United States in the 90s where people said, we know enough about nature that we can actually build the building blocks of nature, the producers and the decomposers and the consumers, and actually seal it up hermetically from Biosphere 1, the Earth, and live in it. And they did that. 6 or 7 scientists crawled inside and see if they could recreate an ecosystem that would hold them. And they failed. They weren't able to stay alive, and they had oxygen levels were declining, CO2 was going up. So they weren't able to keep alive in Biosphere 2. All the king's horses and all the king's men couldn't put the ecosystem together again. The interesting thing about this is if you look at the numbers, Biosphere 2 was 3.14 hectares. And if you divide that by the number of people, you get 0.44 hectares. But if you take the number of people that live on the planet with us now, 7 billion people, and you take the total area that's available for us to live, we get 2.13 hectares of land. Now, I figured this room is about a half a hectare. So 4 rooms. 4 rooms is all we have as individuals to keep us alive. And 4 rooms of land. We also have, to be fair, we have 5 hectares of water, of the oceans. But that keeps us alive every day. It gives us enough to eat, it provides oxygen for us, it provides these services of ecological decomposition, et cetera, and it keeps the rest of these species alive. So when we talk about protected areas, we're really in a game of dividing up how many of the small number of rooms that we have for each of us and where we want to allocate it to stay alive. But we know that the natural part is what's keeping us alive. So somewhere between 0.44 and what we have is the tipping point that's going to keep us alive. We have this great news of the world's increase in protected areas. Everyone knows this curve or has seen this curve, and this is the greatest change in land use that we've seen. And we contrast that to this bad news of continuing ecological decline, which we've talked about. This comes from the Red List Index and the Global Biodiversity Outlook. So the task force is looking at why. Where's the disconnect here? And the why is we may not have put protected areas in the right places. They might simply not be working for various reasons, or there's simply not enough of them. We haven't allocated enough rooms to nature, or enough of the room to nature. So the task force is focusing on answering all of these questions, but for the rest of my talk, I'm just going to focus on this second question about why they may not be working, or in fact, what makes them work. If you look globally, we know that we've put our protected areas in places that we didn't want for other reasons. In the high places, the dry places, the cold places, and the places on steep slopes. But we also know that of the whole protected area state that we've built, we know that 40% of them have virtually no management, no protection. So they're open to the kinds of issues that Bill was just talking about. The other problem we have is that very few protected areas actually measure biodiversity outcomes. It's a hard measure to get. Do these places work? So part of the work of the task force, and this was led by Jonas Geldman and all, actually did a systematic review of all the studies that looked at whether protected areas worked. And there's kind of 2 ways to measure it. You measure species changes, and then you measure where you're hanging onto the land cover. Each one of them have problems, which we won't get into. But the bottom line is, yes, they work sometimes. Some of them don't, some of them do. The majority of them seem to work, but there's a large number of them that are having real problems. So we tried to set out and figure out why. When do they work and when do they not, or what are the drivers of success? This is the literature. We have these land cover studies. We have these studies of species like this from marine ecosystems. Let's start with Ian Craigie, who's part of the team. And Ian published this for Africa, and he looked at he gathered up all of the population trends in African protected areas since 1970. And lo and behold, he found this steady decrease in the overall number. So this is all populations put on a kind of an equal scale, averaged together, and you see this decline. The interesting thing is when you take this curve and you break it apart, you see really different things in different places. So Western Africa is having major problems, increasing decline. Eastern Africa, we're seeing a decline inside protected areas. In Southern Africa, like that wonderful example we saw today from Namibia, is seeing a real dramatic increase in numbers. This doesn't tell the whole story because you have to really figure out what's happening outside these protected areas to compare them to. So another project that Stu Bouchard and a number of us worked on was to look at where we had data for protected areas inside that were protected and equivalent areas that weren't protected to get a counterfactual. So we looked at these important bird areas, we looked at the red list, we looked at Alliance for Zero Extinction sites, and which ones, how are they doing as protected areas versus unprotected areas. And the results are interesting. If you look at important bird areas, the ones that aren't protected, you're seeing a fairly significant decline in the overall populations there. If you look at the ones that are protected, small decline, but not nearly as dramatic. And the same thing for Alliance for Zero Extinction sites. And this is a first measure of actually how well protected areas are doing relative to outside at a larger scale or a global scale. This is Bill's work, which is going to talk about, because I heard he wasn't coming, but this is a really important paper and I highly recommend it to you. So the task force then said, okay, let's collect as much information as we can on population time series and correlate it with every predictor variable we can think of and run this as a global model. And we run it in something called a fixed effects model, or mixed effects model rather. We got data from all over the place. We ended up getting close to 2,000 time series for 550 species in 447 protected areas in 72 countries. So it's global. Here's the drivers that went into the model. Management things, social things, political things, land use context, all of the stuff that we all worry about every day in these kind of analysis. So I'd just like you now to pick which one you think was the most important driver, because I'm going to show you what we found. So this is what the data look like. It's biased towards mammals from Africa, biased towards birds from Europe, but we do have enough data, and this is just a relative index, we do have enough data to have really strong statistical significance in what we found out. The first thing we did, because we just wanted to play with the data, is to look at protected areas and how it compared to the Global Living Planet Index. This is the overall Living Planet Index, and you see this downward trend. Well, if you look at just the stuff we had for inside protected areas, we actually see stability or slight increase, which is great news. You can't really compare the two. It's a bit of apples and oranges, but it's least indicative. Protected areas overall on the planet, are indeed working. So since we have this mix of ones that work and ones that don't, what are the drivers? I'm a conservation biologist, and I expected the conservation biology stuff to show up first. It didn't. So what kind of protected area it is, what IUCN class, wasn't a strong predictor at all. It didn't seem to matter. Park size didn't seem to matter. Neither did fragmentation or the road density or urbanizations or the population density. That doesn't mean these things are unimportant, but they aren't the key drivers of global success. The key drivers are the socioeconomic variables and the things that people have been talking about. And all of these things co-vary, which means they all tell the same story. Infant mortality, Human Development Index, the Corruption Index, the Gross Domestic Product, or the Gini Index, which measures really the difference between rich and poor people in a country. They were by far and away the big predictors of success. So when you hear this message that you have to think about people and their context if you're going to have conservation, well, this is empirical proof that is indeed so. The other thing that we found is that, at least since 1970, is that larger bodied animals are doing far better than the overall average of animals. And it seems like since the 1970s we've paid attention to larger bodied things. Conservation efforts have worked, and we're seeing a really significant, and this is a very powerfully statistical measure, this is highly significant, that larger bodied animals are doing great. And it's not just elephants and rhinos, because we took those out because we thought it might bias the data. It's everything. It's larger birds, etc. This made me reflect on the IUCN mission. Since I was working with the IUCN's mission is a just world that values and conserves nature. And certainly the socioeconomic factors seem to be driving global protected area success in conserving nature. So what can we conclude from this? That certainly understanding protected area outcomes are complicated. And if you go through the literature, you'll find some work and some don't. There's not enough people measuring whether or not protected areas work. And if you do measure them, if you're in that position to be measuring them, please measure inside and outside, because without that counterfactual, we're not going to tell exactly. But many lines of evidence support the idea that protected areas work when they're well managed, when there is no corruption, when there is some kind of reasonable human condition to live in, essentially. And certainly the global results vary by region. We're going to be doing more on this. We're going to be analyzing, we've got a marine model underway. We're going to be looking at the regions to try and parse out differences in the regions. We know for Canada, for example, when we just run a Canadian model, all of a sudden those issues like size, park size, come out as being really important. And we couldn't do this. We have a partnership with the Living Planet Index, and if you have data to share, we're trying to put together a global data set on protected area effectiveness, and if you'd love to contribute to that, we would welcome you with open arms. And the full results of our work are going to be profiled next November in Sydney at the World Parks Congress, so hope to see you there for that. Thanks.